All right. Okay, good. That's on. All right. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of the consequences of the type of representation we sort of painstakingly went through last time. All right. So if you remember last time, what we looked at and what we created, sort of out of more or less our thin air and set of choices and intuition, what we created was a representation where essentially we went from images to time series to dynamics to what we called our behavioral space. And what that behavioral space really was, hold on, let me put this a little bit further up. All right. What that behavioral space really was, right, or what it is a representation about what are the behaviors, or what are the stereotype behaviors that are being performed at any given time. So let's just look at this again, just to refresh our memory. So we had this space, right? And so each of these peaks represented stereotype behaviors. And interestingly, one of the nice features of the space is that you could watch to see how points were moving around through here, right? We could actually look to see the speed within this two-dimensional space, and we saw this nice sort of sit-switch dynamic where it would stay in one spot, then move quickly, stay at one spot, move quickly, stay at one spot, move quickly. We could see that again by this speed histogram that we had at the bottom, right? So it'll really sort of sit at a peak and then move, sit at the peak and then move. So one of the things you can do to sort of really see what the effect of this is you can split the data down the middle. So let's say I'm going to go and take that map I showed in the previous slide, and let's histogram everything that was over here and put it on that side, then put everything over here on this side. So this should be our sort of non-stereotype behaviors because it's sort of zipping through. And these are the places where it's sitting and hanging around for a while at a particular place on that map. And if you do that, what you get is it breaks down like this. So you can really see that in the stereotyped case, so the things that were in that left pause peak, it's really punctate, right? You have these all little peaks which are lined up, whereas in the non-stereotyped case, it's pretty much blurred out, except for this thing over here, which is due to a little bit of a weird noise problem you get at the idle state. Because of the fact when you're not moving, you're basically trying to do a dimensionality reduction of noise. And so locally right there, you can't embed the idle state within a 2D place. Yeah? So I would say it's not this is not implicit. So all I was saying, so how I defined the stereotyped, right, was I said that it's staying somewhere for a while. It's not moving on this map, right? It could have been sort of anywhere, right? I could stay here, I could stay here, I could stay here, I could stay here, I could stay here. So it could have just been some big blob. But if you actually look at just the stereotype behaviors, things segregate out much more nicely than even what we saw in the previous thing, right? And this is sort of how what we're going to be using to proceed today, right? Is how do we actually, how do we use this in order to say something about not just this repertoire, right? So this is basically a statement about the density or how much you're doing each behavior, right? The height of that peak is roughly related to how much you're doing that behavior. But what we want to say is how do you move on this space, right? If I'm over here on this peak, what am I likely to do next? How long am I going to stay there? When am I going to move to the next thing? What am I going to do 10 moves from now, 20 moves from now, 1,000 moves from now, 10,000 moves from now? And can we build up some theoretical infrastructure in order to at least come up with, if not a normative theory, at least a descriptive theory to figure out what types of dynamics might be generating these things? And hopefully at the end we'll have a little bit of time to think about how those different types of dynamics might also relate to different types of analogies and different types of models that we would want to put on this. So that's it. So, but before we get that, I do want to say there's another type of measurement we can make. Right? So there's sort of two basic types of measurements. So one is this repertoire measurement, right? Or how much how much of each behavior is being performed in a given circumstance. This other is how do you move between these various different behaviors. So let's take a brief moment to think about the first one, and then we'll spend most of the lecture on the second. So if we have this space, we can do something just as an illustrative example. Oops. We can look, for example, at male and female fruit flies. Right? Same age, same rearing conditions, same everything. Right, so these are both relatively young, 1 to 2 weeks in age. And so here's male fruit flies over here, and the female ones roughly the same number. And you can see that there's some pretty big changes in density. Right? So the biggest one is you notice that this peak over here is really big, and this one's really small. And this just, whereas this one it's bigger, and this one's a little bit smaller. And this just tells you that male flies are lazy. Right? Essentially that you can see that, and this has been well known, like you can go back and read all sorts of papers and see this. So, and this is obviously way too big of a hammer to get that, but it's always nice to be able to reproduce things that you know should be true. But we can do a little bit better. So let's focus in on that lower left-hand corner, which is like posterior and wing-like movements. And let's see what we can see. So if we focus in on there, what you're seeing here is you take those two PDFs after some normalization, because the males and the females spend different amounts of overall time in this region. What you can see, you've basically just subtracted the female minus the male. So here, if it's red, that means the females are more likely to perform that behavior. If it's blue, it's the males. You can do whatever your favorite statistical significance test, doing some crazy multiple hypothesis nuttiness, and that's what these little black lines are. So we can find these regions. And so let's look, for example, at those two things in this corner over here. Right? One of which is a behavior where the males tend to do it more in the blue, and one where the females tend to do it more in the red. And these are both left-wing grouping. So for those of you that have seen me talk before, you don't get to answer. But can you tell the difference between what these two things are? Probably easier for these guys on this side of the room. Any takers? Catherine's back there smiling. Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can see sort of here the leg just sort of pushes straight back, and here they take the little leg and he loops it out, or he or she loops it out the side, right? So you can see like, and we can actually we can see that visually. We can go back and look at those stereotyped movements in this high-dimensional space, and you can see that they separate nicely between those two different things. They actually are two different behaviors. Is it evolutionarily relevant or ecologically relevant or ethologically relevant? Probably not. Is it likely due to the fact that these things are compressed inside of a thing and the females are bigger than the males? Yeah, likely. But that being said, the point is that we didn't have to look for this, right? Is that you could sort of assay this. So this is the sort of thing that the physicists are less excited by, but like the neuroscientists and geneticists are a little bit more excited by, because now you can do whatever your favorite manipulation is to an animal, measure their behavior, and then sort of see what things go up, what things go down. Again, not always the most exciting thing, but it's definitely a useful thing that can sort of generate a lot of things. One sort of slightly more useful example than this is, and this is the only example of sort of this type of analysis I'll show before getting into the other, is I have some really great collaborators at Genelia Research Campus, Jessica Candy, Gwyneth Card, and David Stern. And this, my friends, is a fly brain, in case you were ever curious what a fly brain looks like. Probably it's a little hard to see the purple. But basically, what you're going to do is you have some set of neurons here, and these are these things labeled in green. And what these guys were able to do is they're able to put in what's called a channel rhodopsin into just these neurons. Out of all the neurons in the fly, just these ones. And what that channel rhodopsin does, and it's a redshifted one, means when red light is shined on it, it opens up a bunch of ion channels, and the neuron fires. And because the fly's cuticle is translucent to red light, we just have a big honking red LED in the background, turn it on, and you excite a neuron. Now the question is, what's going to happen to the behavior when you turn that neuron on? Right? When you
turn on that red light. And so what you're going to see over here is a movie where as so the light, this is averaged over a bunch of conditions, but as the light turns on, it'll turn on at t equals 0, then it'll stand for 15 seconds. So sort of all around at t equals 0, goes up to the top, and 15 seconds, it'll go back to normal. And so because of this, right, we can actually we can do some statistics on this. I won't bore you with that because that's way too complicated and would take me way too much board space. But you can actually do some statistics to do this properly, and you can isolate, oh, it's that region up in the very top, which was excited when you turned on that red light, and it's pretty robust. So you can see this happening over and over again. There's control animals where it doesn't happen. And it turns out, in this case, you'll see when the red light turns on, they're going to groom their head uncontrollably for 15 seconds and turn off. So these are sort of fun sets of experiments we've been working on in collaboration, just because it's just mind control. And we're thinking about this from a perspective of thinking about it from how do you do coding through this limited bandwidth channel, which some people are going to be doing a project on, or are doing a project on. But this is sort of the type of thing you can do this way. But that's not really what I want to talk about so much today. What I want to talk more about is this idea of long time scale structure in behavior. And thinking about really how might you see that, and what do we even mean by long? What defines long here? And so let's do what we generally like doing. So we have a bunch of these states. And as we said, right, you can sit in one state, then move, sit in a state, move, sit in a state, move. So let's just break this thing up into a bunch of states. Let's just do the dumbest thing possible and there's a bunch of local maxima on there. Let's make each local maxima a state. We'll call that a state. So if it comes to rest within sort of the region near that local maxima, we're going to call that, okay, the fly was doing that state at that time. So we have to be near that peak, and then you also have to be in that rest part of that velocity, of that speed histogram, right? So on that left peak. And we can then measure, where do you go? So here, what you're seeing is, of course, our Markov transition probabilities. So a Tij, or T, and I'm going to do this in terms of discrete time. So we're going to, for most of the analyses today, we're going to ignore the fact that you could stay in a state for some amount of time. I promise if you do these analyses where you include that amount of time, so this is going to be a discrete time Markov process. I promise if you do it with a continuous time Markov process, all the results are qualitatively the same, just a little cleaner this way. Right, so, and if you want to yell at me for that later, please do. So something of this form, Tij is probability of xt plus 1 equals I, given xt equals j. And that's what's plotted up here. So the thickness of the line, and the scale bar went away. But sort of, for those of you in the back, like a thin line like this is about a probability of 0.05. So I've gotten rid of all probabilities less than 0.05 on this graph. And these are all these conditional probabilities. And because I'm a physicist, we went by the right-handed rule. And so the curvature is implying the direction, so with a right-handed bias. So for example, this guy is going back over here. Right? And the important thing to note here, just looking at it initially, is that this doesn't look random. Right? There aren't too many transitions like all the way across the side of the map. Right? Most of these things are pretty local. Right? This could have been a massive hairball. Right? Because we had that big velocity peak, right? It could have just done this, then sort of zipped up here, and that would have been mathematically legal. But that's not what we see. And this actually might tell us something about the types of behavioral dynamics that we're likely to see. Right. And just as a reminder, you can coarsen this up. And so you have these different regions here, idle, slow, these are just names that I put on. And these are also regions that I made. But we're going to try and figure out if we can make these regions automatically a little bit later. But you can sort of see that you see sort of this overall structure where the fly is moving similar parts of its body in different regions, and that was by construction, right? Because when we were building these maps, we already did this postural decomposition where we were looking at different aspects. So if you're nearby on this map, you're moving similar parts of your body at similar speeds. And so this idea of Markov transitions is a way of describing behavior, right? So I'm at this one peak now, and I should add here we have, it's order 100 peaks or states. So don't take that number too seriously. I think for some of these analyses it's 117 states, but you could slightly change that number by changing that convolution to create slightly fewer peaks. But just for the standpoint of understanding what we're doing today, this will be done on the scale of roughly 100 peaks, and we're going to see whether we can sort of simplify our description more than that. Right? So, and that's going to be the idea. But going back to the biological literature, right? So that's what we really want to do at the end of the day is not write down some math. What we really want to do is figure out something about what the animal is doing and why it's doing it within whatever context it's currently in. And in the 70s and 80s, there was just an ungodly number of papers, like probably in the order of hundreds, where people took an animal, measured its sequence of behaviors. So in this case, this is this Richmond and Sachs paper from 1980. And they took this, I think this is a Norwegian rat, and basically they measured various aspects like that figure that I showed the other day. And they said, okay, here are these 11 different body parts, and if they're moving certain numbers of them, we're going to call it a state. Then some poor person had to go and write down all these transitions by hand. And then they do a bunch of analyses, and they say, oh, look, this looks Markovian, this looks modular, because in this Markov transition matrix, we see a bunch of blocks. Right? So if you see what people want to say a lot of the time is that if this is your, let's say, this is your current state, and this is your final state, they want to see sort of that you're going to get sort of this blocky thing with maybe a few points out here, right? So you're basically looking for these blocky transition matrices, and there's a lot of these papers where you looked at them and said, oh, look, we did look at this transition matrix, it looks blocky. Yay. Okay, next animal. And so, but we want to take that seriously. Right? Let's take this idea of a Markov model seriously and see how far that takes us. Right, so this is our picture. Right? We have a bunch of these things. We've measured these from a lot of data, and for the most part, we can actually measure those transition probabilities rather accurately. Because, so our data, just to give you a sense, for these data that I'm going to be showing you today, there's roughly about let's say 600,000 total transitions between 100 states, and it's a pretty sparse matrix overall. So actually, most of these transition probabilities are measured reasonably well. So, but let's actually try and take the idea seriously.
So I got one question.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, how much of the structure of this matrix depends on your choice of time for the binning in the first place? Right, you have to define a time to define these states, right?
So no, you don't define a time, right? Because you can be staying still in a state for as long as possible, right? And actually, if you were to look at the residency time in each of the states, those states each have very different residency times. So if this were a continuous time Markov process, the diagonal elements would have varying different values. However, they all look pretty exponential in their waiting time distribution.
What do you choose for your discrete time?
So this is easy. So you don't need to. So we're discretizing in time, not in time, but in transitions. So you don't pick a time scale. The data does tell you that, because you're saying what you see in the data is it'll stay one place, then move, stay one place, then move. You just only pick the points where it's staying one place, and you ignore the points where it's moving. And so all your waiting time between behaviors can vary depending on how non-stereotyped it is. And to me, that actually is an important part of at least this approach. And there's a lot of other approaches that people have been thinking about. But what I like about this is it allows you to have not every point in time is a thing, right? You can have these transition, these either non-stationary or transition things which are, not non-stereotyped, or these sort of transition things which you don't really see too often in the data set. Okay, so the time scale is more set by what's in the wavelet transform rather than what's in anything that I've picked here. And that's a multi-scale thing, so that's actually picking many timescales. Right, great. Any other questions? All right, good. So first of all, let's just try and think about what this means. So let's take the idea of the Markov process seriously and see what this predicts when we have longer timescales. All right, so just to sort of redefine our nomenclature a little bit, we'll say ti1 of ij equals the same thing we had up there. So xt plus 1 equals I given t xt equals j. And again, x here is just which peak am I at some particular time t. And so thus, let's say, so what I really want to define is this t tau ij. And that's the probability of xt plus tau equals I given xt equals j. Right, so now this is sort of a rescaling of time, right? And so now instead of having a time unit of 1, I'm going to say what state am I in tau transitions in the future. Note how this isn't, we're in discrete time here. So we're going transition to transition to transition to transition. And again, I promise this is the same if you were to use continuous time. All right, so we have this. And so we can measure this for the data, right? So the data, we can just measure this thing. The next question is what would we expect to see if Markovian? Right, so if this is a Markov process, right, we can rewrite this. Because if it's a Markov process, it's not history dependent. So we can start pulling this apart. Yeah, Ahmed. Well, because everybody else has been doing it. Let's take it seriously. Let's take the idea seriously, right? So this is a lot of what we do in physics, right? We take simple models and take them to their logical, if illogical, conclusion. So let's do exactly that, and we can learn things from it. No, of course not, right? So first, actually, I'll ask this to the crowd. Why wouldn't we expect animal behavior to be Markovian? I hear some mumbling from over here. Sorry? What? Yeah, but where would that memory come from?
I mean, there's going to be cluster effects. You can't just go from one cluster to another.
Well, but that could just be in here, right? Right? You could do that in a Markovian manner, right?
No, but so for example, if I'm trying, maybe in order to get from one behavior to another, I need to twitch my leg before I can start jumping.
Yeah, but I can do that. I can do this, then that, then that, then that, then that, right?
Okay.
That's saying this is not a hair, right? That's important, but that's why this isn't a hairball, right? That doesn't tell you why it's Markovian or not. You could definitely do that in a Markov model, right? Any other thoughts? Where might that memory actually be coming from? And let's not actually say the word memory, because that's actually somewhat controversial in flies. Why did you guys have I'll put it this way. Which lecture are you more likely to be on time for? The 9 a.m. or the 11 a.m.? This is a non-stationarity in time, right? And there's an internal process that's generating that, right? You're tired and you're sleepy and you're awake and so on, right? And there's this cycle, right? There's all sorts of things, and this is this internal structure in the state, right? There's a time scale associated with that, how you're going to be moving through your own behavior repertoire is going to depend on where these internal states are. You're more likely to go find some food if you're hungry, and whatever else. I mean, so there's all sorts of these internal states going on. And that really is going to be the name of the game. But what we're going to do first is see how wrong this is. Right? Is it a little wrong? Are we talking this stuff as a first order correction? Or is this something that is qualitatively wrong? This is what I mean. You try this dumbest thing first. This is pretty dumb. And you see how badly it does. Spoiler alert, it's going to do really badly. All right. Was there a question over here? OK, good. Okay. So if this is Markovian, right, we can break this apart, right? Because we can break this thing up in parts. So this would just equal, say, P of xt plus tau equals I equals the sum over k of P plus xt plus tau equals I given xt plus tau minus 1 equals k, and then times P tx plus t tau minus 1 equals k given xt equals j. Right, just doing this sum over the k's. So this, because we're Markovian, this is just a time shift of that. So this guy just equals our ti k of 1. Right. And so this is just a matrix multiplication between these two things. And so each time we're going to pull this apart, and we can pull this apart tau times, or pull it apart tau minus 1 times. And each time we pull it apart, we're going to multiply by this matrix again. And so in fact, we can write down this transition of tau. That'll put m in the Markovian case, is just going to be equal to our first order Markov model raised to the tau power. Right? This is just a Markov chain, right? You're just going to multiply this thing over and over again, and it's going to go to the tau. And you're looking at tau transitions in the future. It's going to look like a reduced. Yeah, Greg.
But this is really a first order Markov model?
Right. You can. I also am going to say you can do the same analysis with a second, third. Well, with the second and third, you don't have enough data to do more than that, and you get the same answer.
But your example of the daily cycle for the fly, you don't know. So yes, there could be longer time scales,
right,
but you don't know whether you just need to include that time scale in your Markov model, and then it's Markov.
Right. So that's what I would argue is that by the time you start, I can say from data, a second or a third order Markov model will give you the same results as what I'm going to show you. And then once you get more than that, you have way too many parameters to say anything anyway. Because when you start talking about a fourth order Markov model between 100 states, I mean, even here, technically, you have 10,000 parameters. Now, not really that many, because T is a reasonably sparse matrix. All right, so if you actually look at what T looks like, so this is actually just plotting that same matrix, but in that same graph, but now in matrix form. And you can see you get this nice sort of blocky structure. So there's a lot of zeros here. So but even then, you're still talking about order about 1,000 to 2,000 non-zero parameters. So it's still a pretty complicated model. So it could, there's some idea that this is enough parameters that you might be able to do something. So how might we want to actually analyze this? Well, one thing we can do is just measure it, right? This is just a quantity we can measure from our data, right? We have all of our data points. We can measure how far apart they are. And we can actually measure what that transition matrix looks like at tau equals 1, 10, 100, 1,000, whatever. And we can also take this matrix, right, which is what we would see from a Markov model, and just multiply that matrix by itself 100 times or 1,000 times and see what it looks like. So if we do that, so here's what it looks like for the Markov model. So initial state on the y-axis, final state on the x. And for the Markov model, for tau equals 100, it's a bunch of vertical lines. Okay. So the fact that it's vertical lines tells us what? Yeah, it's independent of the initial state, which means it's basically random. You're transitioning. You're basically picking something out of a hat, right? This is like the behavioral Moran process or something, right? The previous behavior dies, and then you're picking up the next one, right? And you're picking it randomly out of a hat with that distribution. So basically, another way of saying that is you've lost all information, right? Your sort of autocorrelation scales. This is 100. You've forgotten everything. Let's actually just look to see what we see for the data. For the data, for tau equals 100, there's structure there, right? It's gotten noisier, certainly, but that certainly looks relatively different than what we saw from the Markov model. And we can even go at 1,000, and it's certainly gotten more random. We have more vertical lines, but there's still some structure there. So we'd like to be able to quantify. Yeah, Antonio.
How does this then compare to the secondary value of the
Yeah. We're going to get there in a second. All right. Here. All right. Yeah. So we'll get that. That's the next step, right? So the idea here is we're going to now look at this, and we want a way of analyzing this, right? Because again, we're not going to be very happy. We're not going to be very happy with just saying this looks non-random. We want to put a number on things, right? This is what we do. So the Fermi definition of a physicist, we're people that go putting numbers on the world, right? So let's actually put a number on how do we want to quantify this. And Antonio has it exactly right, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the eigenvalue structure of this, right? And for that, we're going to use a convenient piece of mathematics, which the Perron-Frobenius theorem. Out of curiosity, how many people have seen this before? Okay, about 2/3. So I'm not going to prove it or anything, don't worry. But the basic idea is this. Let's say I've got a transition matrix, and there's formal ways of saying this, but let's say you can get there from here, right? We've got a transition matrix in which I can get from any state starting at any other state. So there's no, like I don't have something which is strictly a block diagonal with no transitions, right? I can be able to get from any state, from one state to another state. Right? And so if you have that, what you basically see is that if you look at the eigenvalue spectrum of this matrix, you find that your first eigenvalue is exactly equal to 1. Right? And that not only that, if we look at the eigenvector, which is related to that, this is proportional to the stationary distribution of the Markov process. So basically, it's related to, it would give you precisely the vertical slice along here multiplied by some constant in order to make it a normalized eigenvector. So basically, that first eigenvector corresponds to the stationary distribution, and that sort of makes sense because you're basically saying that if you're going to multiply this matrix by itself enough times, you should get the stationary distribution out at the other end of the day, right? Because, like, say, if we take our tau 1, the tau, right, which is what our t of tau equals, and we're going to find the eigenvalues of it, so we say, like, eigenvalues v1 equal lambda 1, v1. So if you multiply this matrix by itself lots and lots and lots of times, if tau goes to infinity, then, and this goes to 1, thus v1 has to be sort of what you would expect the distribution to go to at long times. Right? So that's the main thing. And the other thing that you see is that you see, so you have, again, lambda 1 equals 1, which has to be strictly greater than the magnitude of lambda 2, which is greater than or equal to the magnitude of lambda 3, and so on. So there's only exactly one eigenvalue which has a value of 1, and everything else has a modulus of less than 1. And we can then use that. Right. So if we look to see what let's see what the eigenvalues thus are of t of tau. So if we write this down as an eigenvalue problem, all right, we have t1, v1, well, we'll say vk. So we'll look at the kth eigenvalue. And this is just writing down the definition of an eigenvalue. Right? So because of this nature of how the t's multiply by each other, we can multiply each side by t to the 1 to the t minus tau minus 1 power times t1 vk equals lambda k right. So this, because this just becomes tau 1 to the tau, which we'll just write as t tau of vk. And this equals lambda k. But now we can, because we have this term over here is already defined by this, we can multiply this by lambda k. Sorry, we have to pull out 1. So we see, so this will just be tau 1 times tau 1, tau minus 2 times vk. And so thus we can rewrite this part over here as equal to lambda k times lambda k times tau 1 to the t minus 2 times vk. So this becomes a lambda k squared. And you can just keep doing this and doing this and doing this until you run out of your things on the other side. And so this winds up just being lambda k the tau vk. So thus, you can say that your kth eigenvalue of t tau just equals lambda k to the tau. And since we have this, all of our eigenvalues must be decreasing, right? Except for the first one, which will stay at 1. So you have one eigenvalue, which is going to stay at 1 at the whole time. And so we're going to ignore that because that's boring. And we're going to look to see what happens with these. And not only that, is it going to be decreasing? Each of these eigenvalues should be decreasing exponentially with time. Right? Because each time scale, you're going to multiply it again and again. And so you're going to see that this thing should be dropping off precipitously. Let's see exactly what happens when we do this to our data. But now, so is this what we see with a Markov model? In practice, what we really need to do is we need to go and, because we have a finite data set, how we usually do this is we generate a Markov model using the way that Shannon proposed in his original information theory paper, where you have some sequence of states, and then you basically create an alternative shuffled sequence which preserves that initial transition matrix. So if people are curious about how you actually do that, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. Well, I'll go over it very briefly, right? So you have something like 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, or something like this, right? So you say, I'm going to pick a random thing in the data set. So let's say I pick this 3, write down the 3. Pick some other random point in the data set where I see a 3. Here's 1. And then take the next one. So I'm going to do a 2. All right, let's pick some other random point where I see a 2 in the data set here. And then put in the next point, 1, and so on. And so this is basically shuffling the data, but still keeping these first order transition probabilities constant. And so this way you can generate a data set of arbitrary size. So that's really the null model you want to compare against, because what you'll see when you actually look at this is it'll decay exponentially quickly. And then for at longer time scales, it'll sort of die off because you run into the data sampling limit. So doing it on the data, so this is actually what the first, so I didn't put the eigenvalue 1, but that's just constant across to 1. Again, boring. And if you look at eigenvalues 2 through 6, the data are these lines here, and their corresponding Markov model using the shuffled method is this over here, this blue line going down. And this is a log scale. And what you can see immediately from this is the Markov model is really terrible. Not by a little bit, but by orders of magnitude bad. All right, so this is so the Markov model, you should have forgotten everything by maybe 40 or 50 transitions, right? So this is, as Antonio was asking, this is the time scale of the second eigenvalue. So really, probably if you do the 1 over e time, it's somewhere around 20 odd transitions. So it goes down pretty quickly. But we can see that you still have, particularly in these eigenvalues here, a lot of information, even 1,000 transitions into the future. And so if you put that in terms of actual units of time, that's 10 minutes-ish, somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes. So it's basically saying if you tell me what the fly is doing now, I have a little bit of information. If you were to measure this in bits, it's about like 0.2, 0.3 bits of information about what the fly is doing, which isn't huge, but it's non-zero. It says that there really is this long timescale structure in the data, which you can explain for these simple models. And as Greg was asking, maybe you could have done this with a second order or a third order Markov model. You get these curves move slightly to the right, but it's not enough to get a qualitative difference. And you could even do a hidden Markov model without doing too many fancy bells and whistles, and it also looks very similar to this. Yeah?
How long are the experiments?
The experiments here are an hour long. So about 10 to 20 minutes is about as long as you could hope to actually measure. Ilya.
So you mentioned at some point analogy with language, right?
I'm going to be very unhappy with the analogy of language towards the end of my talk.
Fine. So usually when people model sentences in language, the current idea is that we don't model them using Markov models, but let's say suffix trees or prefix trees or things like that, where the depths of the network of the model can grow as needed, right? So what are your thoughts how that would look like here?
Right, so I mean, one could write down something that looks like, say, a hierarchical hidden Markov model. So for those of you who haven't seen, have hidden Markov models come up yet? No? Okay. So the basic idea, because this will probably be a useful thing to talk about anyway. So for a hidden Markov model, right? So for a Markov model, you would say like x1. I'm writing this in the same way that like David was writing these sorts of things. So you'd say that for a Markov model, this arrow means there's a conditional dependence. This is called a graphical model, right? So you have p of x2 given x1, right? And there's no history dependence. For a hidden Markov model, we have two sets of states. Let's say we have some y's, so y1, y2, y3, y4. x2, x3, and so forth. And so if you go to a textbook, the example that people like giving is ice creams and temperature outside, number of ice cream cones sold and temperature outside, right? Let's say you can only measure the number of ice creams sold, but that's going to have an intrinsic dependence on what the temperature is outside, and so you can sort of actually try and make an inference as to what this variable might be based off of measuring the thing which is actually output, which are the x variables, right? And then what Ilya is suggesting is maybe you can be even more complicated and add like other statements. We now have z's at this level up here, which can affect all sorts of crazy things. Or you could even have some autoregressive processes where the x's then have a dependence on each other as well. And I can say, without having these, you can't reproduce these types of dynamics. These are actually having these multiple eigenvalues decay is super non-generic, right? As poor Catherine can tell you, it's really hard to actually write down a simple model that does this, right? She spent quite a bit of time trying to do this. You can write down plenty of complicated models that do this, and so you could add hierarchical structure. I'm going to try and make the argument that actually this is going to be very different than language, and we're going to get to that hopefully towards the end. Yeah, Greg.
So you're using this analysis to try to constrain the complexity of the transition model that you have for flies, and you're saying that it's some class that's not Markovian.
Right.
But
Well, it's not easily like you can always add in more parameters and get there.
Fine. But it's an hour. Nobody believes animals are stationary for an hour. So how do you know that it's some non-stationary process couldn't?
Of course it is, right? And so the question is, of course, that's exactly what we know is happening. There's some non-stationary process which generates this. However, you see this generically. It's not just you caught them at some weird point of the day, right? And so actually I'm going to show that now, right? So you see this across a wide variety of systems beyond just flies in a dish for an hour.
Sure, but I guess argument, going back to Chomsky and Shannon, about the complexity of language, to bring in that analogy.
Let's not bring in language. I was planning on spending my whole last thing completely trashing the idea of language as a model for this.
Specifically an argument about the complexity of the data stream, not about stationarity. And so the question is that the argument that you're making, or is it an argument about stationarity versus non-stationary?
My question, I don't know if I'm making an argument about stationary and non-stationary. In the back of my head, I know it's not stationary. But the question more is, what type of model do you write down, right? And that's really what I'm trying to get at. And so the point of this, and the point of all these analyses, wasn't to say, oh, Markov models are bad, although that's a side product. Really, it's say, because probably we would have been happy if we could have write down a Markov model, right? That means that we can understand it, we can make predictions. It tells us something about the types of model. It constrains our theories. And that's really all what I care about here. And from there, I view this as observation. Right? I did a very fancy measurement, but it's a measurement nonetheless, and we use that measurement like any theorist should do to constrain our future theories. Yeah, Ilya.
So another question here, maybe relevant to what Greg said. Suppose I ran a Markov model, and I just had a single time scale with which all the parameters in the Markov model change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can we rule out, using these plots, the idea that there is just, let's say, a periodic drive?
Yeah, so I have done that analysis. You can rule it out. Basically, what makes it really non-generic is the fact that multiple eigenvalues decay slowly. Right? It's pretty easy to write down a model where 1 or 2 eigenvalues decay slowly. But to write down something where 6 of them are decaying slowly like this, you can't do that with any sort of simple addition to a Markov model, like having a periodic drive. Of course you can put those timescales in by hand, right? You can always do that, right? So that I think, now that being said, I don't have a proof, right? So that actually could have been a project I could have given you guys, but I don't have a proof. I don't have a proof to actually write down to show that you need to actually put those timescales in by hand, but that is my hunch from just doing this a lot. Right. Good. Yeah, Michael.
So the transition probabilities for TIJ1,
Hmm?
do they change with time?
Not. So they do to a certain extent. I will say that they do. The only extent that they do is that because of the fact that you have Perron-Frobenius theorem, and that the first eigenvector is the stationary distribution. Right? If the stationary distribution is changing, the transition matrix must also change. So you do see certain changes between individuals, but what I will say is that this holds across bootstrapping. And what you can also do is just run this analysis for each individual separately. And we also can do it for the first half versus the second half. You always see this. I'm not showing everything because I wanted to spend more time at the chalkboard. But yeah, these are all things that we worried about. And yeah, so the first half and the second half both show if you do each individual separately, each individual separately shows this effect. So this seems to be super robust. And not only is it robust in these, so just to show a few examples where we also see this from other things that we've been doing. So these are some plots that Catherine made about, so this is flies of various different ages. And basically running the same thing. So you have male and female flies. Each thing is a different 2-week period in the age of the fly with a bunch of flies averaged together. And you see the exact same effect. Or you can do this so this is some other work where we have these cute little prairie voles talking to each other. These are pair-bonded animals, and they're very desperate to get to break down that wall. There actually was one experiment where they did. And you see the same sorts of effects here. Or even, not in behavior, but even if you look, and so this is actually work from an undergrad we had in the group, you can even do this for human ECOG data. So these are epilepsy patients at the Emory Epilepsy Clinic, where they have 128 channel electrodes in their brain, where we can measure them for a week-long data sets. You could do the same analysis, but now looking for dynamical structure in these neuronal data sets instead of the behavioral time series. Just run the same thing. And you look at transitions, and now look how terrible the Markov model is. Right? This is like 6 orders of magnitude bad almost. 4 orders of magnitude bad at least. So this is something that's the non-generic property. And I'd like to claim it's a non-generic property of how living systems can be characterized. And so the question is, can we write down models that have this type of structure, right? And those models were probably non-stationary. Those models have all sorts of things in them. And so the question, what are the things in the models that have this type of structure, right? And obviously there's a bunch of things that could.
That's a very strong statement, right? That this is how the living systems are.
No, I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, can we ask?
Right. So before one can ask this, I mean, like, we have Massimo somewhere here. Get
Yeah.
the Rayleigh-Bernard turbulence from human lab. Measure velocities at 10 points.
Oh, fair enough.
It's there, right? What are we going to get? I have no idea. Maybe Massimo can dump the data right
All right,
now.
okay.
That's
Yeah.
No, not clear, huh, Massimo? What do you think? What this is going to look like for turbulence?
What? Yeah. Right. But so I mean, this is the point. I don't mean to be that strong with this. The thing is, whenever we do a behavioral data set, we see this. Whenever we've done a neural data set, we've seen this.
So what if you do a behavioral data set on a really simple single cell but high resolution image of like a Myxococcus or something, right? Which has a complicated, that'd be cool.
Yeah. So I should also add that probably the again, in huge scare quotes, universality class of stuff that you would see. This is probably related to stuff where you see stereotyped activities. So there's a question of the Myxococcus example you give has interesting other sorts of things. So it goes to like a spinodal decomposition, other things that Josh Shavitz's group has been working on.
That's many of them. I'm thinking about a single, isolate one. Just watch it kind of do that.
Right. So there's a question of maybe you have to have a repertoire that's sufficiently complicated, right? That could be something which is different. I don't really know. Great. Anything else? Right. And again, so this is just, you can also just do your best to write down a hidden Markov model. This is a simple sort of vanilla hidden Markov model, again, from Catherine, doing the same sort of thing. And you can see data, Markov models here. Hidden Markov model can do a little bit better, but still pretty far shy of it. So we want to try and see something different. What I'm going to try and claim is that how everybody tends to be looking at this is through more of the statistical standpoint. Everybody's looking at these data sets like transition probabilities. And I think the way to try and think about that might eventually be to be towards dynamics. And hopefully we'll have a chance to get to that by the end. All right. So the question is now, how can we try and make sense of this? So before we move to the dynamical picture, let's stay one last time in statistical world and crib from the summer school t-shirt. Let's do an information bottleneck. Right. And really the concept here is, let's try and have a representation. This isn't a model. This is still very descriptive. But can we just have a representation which tells us something about the predictability of the future state? So something, instead of a Markov model, can we write down something which tells us about predictability that actually might say something useful? But before we do that, let's actually think about what we might want to see in this type of model and what sort of aspects might arise. And so for this, let's go back to the biology literature again. And so this is actually this absolutely fantastic book. So from 1951, Tinbergen's The Study of Instinct. And there's this beautiful sort of humbly titled chapter called An Attempt at a Synthesis, which is basically where he tries to create a whole new field, and he essentially does. Right? and the idea that he proposed here, which is related to ideas that other people had as well, was this idea of a hierarchical structure for behavior. But this is kind of what Ilya was mentioning as well, this idea that maybe you can, instead of thinking about this as behavior linearly, maybe you can think about this in terms of the multiple things happening at multiple time scales. And the same event can have different meanings depending on the context. So for example, this is looking at the reproductive instinct in the stickleback fish. Right? There's all sorts of fun organisms these ethologists do. And so you see the same reproductive instinct can go into a bunch of different things, like fighting or building or mating or caring for offspring. And then within each one of those things, there's a bunch of more specific actions, then you could maybe even go further down than that. Right. And so like how I like to talk about it is like, here's like, let's say I pick up a brick, right? You're picking up a brick off the floor, right? So there's multiple sort of behavioral contexts in which that could be used, right? It could be I want to build something with it. It could be I'm picking up the brick to throw at somebody, right? It could be you're picking up the brick as here, honey, here's a brick, or something along those lines, right? So the same behavior, and then that might turn into the throwing, but the general idea is that you can essentially think about the same behavior throughout these different contexts, and maybe there's this hierarchical structure to it. Right. And so Tinbergen's actually probably his most famous student is actually Richard Dawkins. And as I said last time, before he was Richard Dawkins, was a fly grooming expert. And so there's actually a really beautiful review article from '76 where he talks about hierarchical organization as maybe something that could be a general principle for thinking about behavior. Right? And what I like about this, he talks about maybe we need software answers for behavior. So in the same standpoint, and so there's been all sorts of stuff in neuroscience about this recently, about if you were to go and try and understand how a computer works by just taking a microprocessor out and knowing every single detail about the microprocessor, you might not necessarily know something about what that thing is actually doing. So in a lot of ways, it's more useful to know what the algorithms and what the software is rather than knowing every small little detail inside. And that's not to say those details aren't interesting, but maybe there's a value from going at both directions. And what he was proposing is basically building off of Tinbergen's work and this was actually at some conference that was honoring Tinbergen for winning his Nobel Prize, where thinking about sort of maybe you can build up these algorithms and these structures where behaviors can have different values in different contexts. Yeah, great.
I was curious, historically, were these guys influenced by people thinking about hierarchies in organizations?
No, so Simon came after this. So
Before?
After. Simon's big hierarchy paper was in 1960. Yeah, but Tinbergen was this is 1951. So, yeah, no. So, and if you read this paper, so Greg is referring to Herb Simon, who was thinking about hierarchical structure in engineering. Who sort of along sort of at similar time spans, but I think they sort of converged on the same thing. And in this paper, Herb Simon makes a lot of appearances, sort of in citations on this particular paper. But I think they came sort of at it from the same sort of, because they were thinking about very similar types of problems of how do you control an ungodly mess. And hierarchical ideas there's a lot of mathematical nicety about it. So let's see, so thinking about that, maybe let's take a look at the data and see what sort of structure might emerge. And so for here, let's do another information bottleneck calculation. We have to do one more before your class is over. And specifically, what we're going to do is, so if x of t is the current state of the system, we're going to try and write down some coarse-grained variable z of t. So it'll be some mapping p of z given x. And then, but we want that to have as much information about the future state of the system, xt plus tau, as possible. So how this is going to wind up turning up is we're going to actually have a set of bottleneck solutions, because for each value of tau, we can rerun the thing again. Right? And so what we'll say is our cost function, I'll write it as a maximum. We want to maximize the mutual information between xt plus tau and z of t while subtracting off the mutual information between x of t and z of t. So you want to have as simple of a representation as possible, again with your beta acting as your Lagrange multiplier, modulating which direction of this you're going to go in. And then you're going to wind up solving this. Okay? And you would do the typical
Aramoto algorithm. Did Steph do this? Oh, wouldn't she? No, she didn't. All right. Long story short, you can actually go and I don't want to go through and take the time to derive it or anything, but essentially you can wind up solving this by doing a set of alternating consistency equations. And so if you go to the original information bottleneck paper from Tishby and Bialik and all, then you'll see sort of how you actually run through and do that. Right? But just take my word for now. You can actually go and you can minimize this thing, and you can minimize it for different values of beta. And so different values of beta, you're going to have different complexity model. You can also do this for different values of tau. Right, so you want to maximize this thing and minimize your representation. And what you would expect to see, so let's plot, this is I, xt, and z of t, and this axis is going to be I, xt plus tau, and z of tau. How are these curves? What are these curves going to look like? Right. So you're probably going to have a point down there, right? Because if you just have one cluster, you'd have no information. And then they're going to probably they're going to be moving up, but it's sort of bounded by this y equals x line. So we're going to have a curve like this. So this is, say, for t equals 1. Right? And then you would imagine that you're going to be able to forget, like the further out in time you go, the less information about the future you're going to have. And so you'd expect that next line, tau equals 10, tau equals 100, and so on. Right? And so these are going to be sort of trade-off curves as you modulate beta. So as you allow more and more complex representations, you can predict more, but you also have a more complex representation. So these are sort of your optimal solutions along this. Let's actually see what the data does. And sure enough, our data more or less looks like this. So tau here is color-coded, and you can see that as tau increases, these curves go down. But notice how they don't go exactly to 0, right? There's always, at least from, this is going up to tau equals 1,000, and you can see there's always at least some small, tiny little gap at the bottom. Right? And that's just more or less telling us what we saw already from the Markov model, that there still is some information, 1,000 to a couple thousand transitions into the future. But now what we can do is we can move up along one of these curves. So let's go 100, right? That's what we looked at before. So like say this curve here. And we can look to see basically what this z is. This z is a partitioning, right? So if this is our original behavioral space, which is also a fly, you can see that, like, how is this going to break down, right? So what's going to be the structure of how you're going to predict this, right? It could be that this thing breaks up into like a chunk, and then it breaks down like this, and then it breaks down like that, and that would sort of have this hierarchical picture. Or it could just break down in any sort of weird way, where like this is your first coarse graining, and then you have a second coarse graining, which might keep this area, and it could be rather complex. But if you actually look to see what happens, actually rather surprisingly nice. So this is again moving around this tau equals 100 line. You can see as you go sort of move up and over, you can take the sort of the most informative one cluster solution is obviously boring, right, because there's only one cluster. The next one is two clusters, and you sort of see this section breaks off. This next one, this section over here breaks off. This one, this section breaks into two, and so on. So you have this hierarchical partitioning of the space. Now you could make an argument that you should have to have this binary coarse graining because of the way the information bottleneck works, but you wouldn't necessarily need to have it because this algorithm knew nothing about the space, right? I just gave it numbers from 1 to 100, and it said, okay, how am I going to group these things together? It didn't know which numbers were next to each other. So this idea that this continuity of the space tells us something predictive says something maybe about that the result actually is hierarchical. And put in a different, yeah?
So if we cut to the last one, I don't want to stick in the way. But the yellow is not, right?
What?
The yellow is not exactly hierarchical. it comes out of 2 clusters in one.
Well, yeah, at the very, so, right, so you mean this thing. Yeah, I mean, as you get further and further along, it gets harder because you start running out of data, right? But even then, we can show this sort of, it's much more hierarchical than you would naively expect it to be, right? Is basically how I describe it, and by orders of magnitude more than what you would expect from a Markov model or from random data. Yeah, Greg.
I mean, it's also surprising because it could have been hierarchical in, not in 2 dimensions, but in higher dimensions, in which case you wouldn't see this.
Exactly. Right. So it's a surprise. Like, it was nice. Like, I sort of had a hunch it would work because I had just played with the data a lot, but it came out like this. So you have this hierarchical structure. And not only that, because, again, the space is organized in a way where it's nearby things are moving similar parts of its body at similar speeds, you can actually sort of write down, put names on these things. Like, the first thing that goes is idle, then everything else. Then locomotion goes off everything else. Then everything else goes to anterior and posterior, and then sort of so on. And even down here, it gets a little bit messy, but it's still, there still is some hierarchical structure as you move through this thing. So you really have this tree-like structure that emerges like this. We can quantify this. I don't want to take the time just to say, I'm going to just flash this up here, that one can actually put a number on this. So this is in our in the paper we've published on this idea, but you can actually put a number on how hierarchical this is, right? And so each one of these lines is this measure of treeness, which is relating to if you move up a tree or down a tree. So as you go from one cluster to 2 clusters, or 3 clusters, to 4 clusters, or 5 clusters, what's the relative entropy of when you're trying to predict which path did you take starting from an endpoint versus which path do you take starting from the beginning? And if you really are tree-like, you should have essentially 0 entropy. Like, if you know what your endpoint is on the, say, the 25 cluster solution, there's only should be one path up through that you could possibly have taken, right? And then you just normalize it by what the entropy is moving downwards. So this is sort of a notion of treeness, and so the black lines here are what you would expect for a Markov model, and then the colored lines are what you get for different the hierarchies you get at different time lags. Right. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So how can we, so we've sort of said that we have this hierarchy of stuff going on at some level, and we have these long time scales. So how can we try and make sense of this? And going back one more time to the biological literature, so this is actually this absolutely remarkable paper from the 70s where Walter Heiligenberg, what he did is he looked at these fish for a really long time, and he did what I was sort of saying yesterday, right? He went and he labeled, all right, the fish did this, the fish did this, the fish did that, attacking, courting, approaching, chafing, and yawning. But then what he did is he actually wrote down, and this is before computers, so he did a lot of this stuff by hand or with some really annoying punch card technology, right? And essentially what he did is he wrote down, okay, what are 4 latent variables, or what are 4 slow time scales which can explain the relative prevalence of these 7 behaviors as a function of time. And so if I had more time, I might actually have shown that analysis, because it's a very nice analysis. It's very simple, it's very linear, but I think it's this idea of how do you actually find sort of these hidden behaviors, right? In the same way that we're talking about sleep versus awake, right? Or circadian rhythm, right? You can't know if you're looking at somebody. You don't have a precise measurement of exactly what your circadian state is. I mean, what you can do is you can infer it. Sometimes you can make a pretty good inference, but sometimes you take an afternoon nap, right? And so you have this sort of structure about what are the things that are actually driving the changes in behavior that aren't the things you're measuring. So I like calling these what are the hidden states of behavior, or the hidden dynamics of animal behavior. And I think this paper is really one of the first that really tried to get at that, is that there are really all of these underlying processes, whether they're sleep-wake or hunger or other animal needs, which figure prominently in most of this literature, or aggression or other sorts of things, right? How do you actually try and infer those from a data set? And what's the picture that you can try and take? And what I really like about the idea is that it's dynamical, right? These are things which don't look like transition matrices or statistical. They look like things which are slowly varying in time and have some sort of internal timescales and many multiple internal timescales. And that to me seems like a reasonable way of generating these types of structures that we see from these Markovian plots. And the fact that you have all of these eigenvalues decaying, all with different timescales, tells me there probably are actually multiple timescales all interacting with each other, pushing and pulling and saying, I'm really tired, but I'm also hungry. And so, right? And so sometimes they move in the same direction, sometimes they move in different directions, and all in all, these sort of hidden states move together in a way to try and modulate the things the animal are actually doing. And can we get at that in some way? And I don't really know how to do that in a principled way. And so our initial approach, and this is going to be, I'm going to describe some work that's brand new, because I feel like it. And this is work that's done by a postdoc in my group, Itai Pinkowiecki. And this is trying to think about what happens as you have this type of dynamical structure. And so what we're going to try and do is we're going to take these transitions. So take our sequences of behavior, right? So we have more than just this transition matrix. We have these long sequences and patterns. And let's just throw parameters at the problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to fit a recurrent neural network to this. So this is what David Schwab was talking about a few days ago. Right? So the idea behind this, and this is going to be a relatively simple framework, is what we're going to do is we're going to parameterize the behavior being performed using something called one-hot encoding, which is just a fancy word for saying if I want to do behavior, say 3, I'm going to put in a vector which is 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. Right? So not behavior 1, not behavior 2, yes, behavior 3, not behavior 4, not behavior 5, not behavior 6. So now I'm going to push all of these things forward, and they're going to be, those signals are going to be put into a reservoir. We have a bunch of little neurons. And these neurons are all taking an input from various ones of these. They're talking to each other, sometimes excitatory, sometimes inhibitory. And you have this overarching sort of structure where they're connected to each other. Now in the output, we're going to have a vector of the same length. And this is going to be from some weighted combination, so forth. Right? They're going to be doing some weighted computation of what's happening with these interior neurons. And so say this one, and say maybe it'll say that, oh, this is going to be giving me, what's my probability of next? And maybe, I don't know, it's something like 0.9, 0, 0.1, 0.05, 0.05, 0. That doesn't, 0.8. Right. Right. So, and then what we do is we sample. Let's say we draw one. Likely we're going to draw that this is going to be 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And then we feed that back in. And we play the whole game again. And what we're going to do is using some of the tricks that David talked about, we're going to try and train this network to go and actually recapitulate the states that we saw. Right? And so this is what Itai did. Right? He figured out how to train it. And this is so what we're using for the aficionados in here, we're using a long short-term memory approach. That doesn't matter so much. This is more for technical reasons. You could get the same, very similar results with different architectural choices. We frankly just wanted to do the simplest thing we could write down that might represent the data. So there's a huge number of parameters in here. I think there's 128 neurons in here. They all talk to each other. And then they all have input weights, readout weights. There's a large number of parameters, but Actually, not so many more than you would see in the Markov model, to tell you the truth. It's order of a few thousand parameters. And if you do that, so the data here is the solid lines, the RNN are the dashed lines. It's not exactly the same, but you start to see a lot of the similar sort of structure. It sort of craps out here at the end a little bit in the second eigenvalue. But even then, now we're talking like a factor of something off. Right? That's much better than several orders of magnitude off. And so we have this structure, and sort of feeding into this neural network, right? And how this thing actually generates longer timescales, I should say, is that each of these nodes have some degree of memory in them. Right? So they remember sort of how recently they've been activated by other things, and so that memory stays and goes away. And if you train it properly, you can get a bunch of different timescales that come out of this. Right? And so we can reproduce, we have a model that does the data, that reproduces this aspect of the data. Let's double check. Let's make sure that this actually also reproduces the information bottleneck results, right? So we should also be able to do the exact same analysis. So we did this analysis on the previous one. Let's see if the same analysis winds up working out for if we run it on this fake data, right? So now that we've generated this network, we can just run it forward, again, as David said, in generative mode. So you can just, now let's generate new sequences of data and see what sort of results we get. And if you do that, it's not 100% identical, but it's very close. You can quantify how similar these things are. So here is what we get for the network. This is the data. And you can quantify the similarities. And actually, if you look to see where the differences are, they tend to be in relatively low probability behaviors. So some of these things on the boundaries, there's some ambiguity even in the original analysis, and sort of they just flop to either side. Like you can sort of see this over here. There's sort of this region here, which can sort of flop around. Yeah, Julia. That's what we're going to try and figure out, right? So this is what I would say is this is a way of just saying this is a model which actually reproduces our summary statistics. Right, so, but now that we reproduce summary statistics, let's try and dig in a little bit and see what sort of things we can possibly learn. So one thing that's interesting is we can try and see, oops, apparently the House passes the spending bill. All right. Right, no. Oops. So one of the things we can do, I usually turn on Do Not Disturb, but so one of the things we can do is we can actually look to see. In fact, I will do that right now. One of the things we can definitely do is to look at the fixed points of this network, right? Because this is a dynamical system. And so what you can actually do is you can actually see what's happening as the structure. So what Itai did is he said, you know what? Let's sort of pretend. Let's clamp the system. All right. This is something from neuroscience. Yeah. Okay. There's one second. All right. Then so what we can do is say, no matter what the network tells us to output. Let's say here we put in a 1. Let's always put back a 1 here in the 3 position, no matter what the network actually outputs. So we can sort of move the system into whatever its stable state is, and then just wait long enough until it relaxes. Okay? Yeah?
What is the fixed point in behavior space?
Well, it's not in behavior space. It's in a neural network, right? This is at the end of the day, it's a dynamical system. Right? We've.
Still corresponds to some kind of
Well, that's what we're going to try and figure out, right? So a fixed point. So let's focus on the math first, and then the interpretation. Right? Because I agree it's confusing. But how I view this is a reparameterization of our behavioral dynamics into a dynamical system. It's a very complicated dynamical system. There's a question of what do we learn about it. But let's do our best. Right? And so this is what our attempt is to try and understand what these fixed points actually mean. Right? Hopefully, ask me again if it doesn't make sense in a second. And again, I should note, this is all sort of very new stuff. I'm excited to share it with you, but it's definitely a work in progress. Yeah, Greg.
Also, if it's a dynamical system, isn't it Markov?
At a very, very fundamental. We're in way high dimension here.
This is LSTMs, right?
Right.
Well, it's passed through continuous nonlinearities, right? It's a nonlinear dynamical system. It's a nonlinear dynamical system that passes through. This isn't a hybrid dynamical system. There's no GR. There's no hard cutoffs. There's no ReLUs here. I mean, it is a yes. Technically, you can reparameterize it as a Markov model, but the dimensionality is so high here, right? I can actually.
Okay, but you told us that it wasn't Markov, and now you're saying it's Markov. It's high dimensions.
But in 2 dimensions is also a very, very long vector of 1 dimensions, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. So it's
a 2-dimensional system. Space is also a bunch of lines.
right. I mean, technically, like if you do a Markov model with an infinite number of possibilities, you can parameterize any system you want, right? I'm saying it's not a simple Markov model. Is all I'm saying, right? You can definitely write this as a very complicated Markov model, but I really prefer not to. Yeah, that would not be fun. Right. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and we're going to go and, as I said, clamp the system. So we're going to pretend this side is always outputting what we inputted in, and then we're going to let the system relax down to a fixed point in the space of this dynamical network. So it's going to be so all of the internal variables within the network will be reaching a constant value. And if you do that, we can do this for each of our behaviors. So each of our, in this case, 117 behaviors. And if you do that, you can actually find what those behaviors are, put them, and then do a dimensionality reduction into the number of abstractions here is really getting nutty. But what you can do is you can find where each of those fixed points are. So each one of these fixed points represents clamping on one behavior. So you can wind up doing that is you clamp on one behavior. Now you have positions in this essentially 128 dimensional space of what all the internal states of all of these neurons are. Actually, it's 256 because there's 128 neurons in here. And each of the neurons has 2 parameters describing its dynamics. So, but what you can basically say is you can do a dimensionality reduction and see where are those points located within this high dimensional space relative to each other. And what we've done is, what Ty did here is you can then take those points and then color them by which of these regions, and here he did it with the 7 cluster solution. And if you color it that way, you can see that the fixed points are located nearby each other. And this is, you can train the network multiple times. Every time you train the network from a different instantiation, you get a qualitatively similar result. So you see all like the red points here and the blue, which were next to each other. The green is here, the silver here. You sort of have to turn it around a little bit. But you basically get the behavioral space structure back out. Again, this thing didn't know the structure of behavioral space. Right, this is just, all it knew is a set of numbers. And it magically figures out the structure reemerges again. And so this picture is, so what I'm not going to, what I don't have time to talk about, is you can actually measure the relative barriers to get from one of these to a different one. And you can actually see that these nearby behaviors with high transition probabilities are indeed related to these sort of noise-related barriers. The other point that I find is interesting is that, so now let's do the same network. Let's start from one of these points and run the network forward, but now without doing the sampling. So instead of feeding the sampled solution, we're just going to feed the probabilities back around. And if you do that, what you find is that the network just always goes very quickly to a very stable fixed point. I guess just a stable fixed point. It's like saying something is very true. Right? It's stable, right? And so it always goes to a stable fixed point. So how do you get dynamics? Right? How do you actually this thing move around? And this thing moves around through the space because it's making choices. Right? This feels philosophically important to me. Right? The fact that you write down this dynamical network, if you don't add the stochasticity from actually deciding to do something versus another thing. Right? And when our whole notion of these behaviors is you're deciding to do one thing instead of something else. But you have this noise added
from the stochasticity from doing one thing versus another, and that's how you move through the space. And this should remind you of the worms. Right? This is very similar to the Langevin-like dynamics that we saw moving from the forward to the backward state, forward to the backward state, and so on, that we saw in the C. elegans dynamics. Just in a crazier, weirder, messier version. Right, so that's one cool thing about this, right, is that we now have some sense of what are the things that are important. And what we notice is this noise, we have this underlying dynamical structure which predicts the structure of the space. But how you move through it, you need not just the structure, but also some noise on top of that. And so the next thing we might want to say is, so what are those neurons actually inside computing? Right? So I hang around a bunch of neuroscientists for a living, and somehow they let me be a professor in a biology department. And you can compute what I call tuning fields. Right? So you can say, let's compute Fij, and that's just going to be sort of our expectation value of the, let's say, the value, say, of neuron I, given that the animal is performing behavior J. Right? And you can compute this for all the different neurons. So in this particular case, so this is for this network. This is what these look like. So each one of these is one neuron, and then these are thus the tuning fields for each of the separate neurons. And it's kind of a mess looking at this. You see some which have some more structure, some which have less structure. But I think you can see this game play out a little bit nicer if we do a slightly different network. And this is what we'll end on, is you can now play a similar game, but now instead of having just this one dynamical system, you can actually keep the same number of parameters. So you take the same total number of neurons, but now you split them between 3 layers. Right? So, well, I think you have to add a couple to make it a multiple of 3, but same general idea. Right? It's 130 neurons instead of 128 now. And you move between those 3 different things, and you see 2 things. First of all, you can actually measure the dimensionality of the dynamics. We use this maximum likelihood dimensionality thing here to show, but you can pick whatever you pick. And you can see that as you move from the first layer down to the 3rd layer, the dimensionality decreases. This is actually trying to measure basically a fractal dimension of the neural dynamics that you're observing. So you go, not a huge difference, but you go from like 7 down to 5. And those are numbers we might actually even believe that we've measured correctly. Those are low enough that maybe they're right. The other thing is that we can measure the power spectrum. And as you go from the first layer to the 2nd layer to the 3rd layer, it slows down. Right? The dynamics at this more abstracted level wind up being slower than you see at the first level. And so now let's compute the tuning fields at each of the 3 levels. And so at the sort of the level closest to the input, you see things which have sort of relatively short length scale structure to them. You move up a level, the length scale structure gets even longer. At the last level, you really see these structures that come out, and not only that, the lines on these structures look a lot like what we saw from the information bottleneck calculation. So dynamically, how you can think about this perhaps is that you have this structure moving across all of these different scales, moving from this hierarchical level of basically what overall type of behavior you're performing to within a region to a different region beneath that. And it's going to be represented through this dynamical system framework. And because we put it in this framework instead of a probabilistic framework, we can hope to say some things and use a bunch of analysis tools that we didn't have otherwise. And just sort of to compare, just sort of put them on the screen at the same time. Here is sort of what the bottleneck clusters look like at the bottom to the top. And it's surprising how often the lines of these fields are at the same time. And so these are what the neurons inside of these networks are responding to. And the idea is hopefully that by understanding some aspect of these dynamics, we can actually move forward and see how sort of this behavioral structure is emerged in a dynamic way. talk too much, so I ran out of time to talk about other things, but I just want to mention that I think this dynamical picture really winds up being a good analogy for understanding how to analyze these things. And the hope is that this more dynamical picture, as opposed to ones you see more from language-based approaches, work better. And I have some strong feelings about this is more like music theory than it's like language, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.